Welcome everyone, and we're going to discuss how to problem solve and work through a NAGI grid for the rehabilitation cases that you'll be working on throughout the courses. If you look in your principles manual on page 106, there is a section called Problem Solving and Scope of Practice that describes functional outcomes classification system from the World Health Organization ICF model for health. Also looking at the breakdown of the functioning, disability, and health, and the subcategories that NAGI developed as a classification system to really classify where the client is and how their lives are impacted. So quality of life is certainly a factor here. And when we look at the impairments, the activity limitations, and the participation restrictions, we'll see how the client's quality of life is impacted. So one of the things we talk about in this section is that when someone has, say, decreased shoulder range of motion, if they are, say a typist or a hairdresser or someone that does nails, that may not be a problem for them at all. It may not have any impact on their activity of choice or their recreation or their work activities. So it may be a little annoying to them to not have good range of motion, but there's no big impact on their quality of life. So what we want to do is look at our clients and figure out what is the major impact to someone's quality of life. What are the functional activities that they are unable to do on a regular basis that restrict them from being able to either participate in recreational activities or their work, especially work. That's really important. If someone can't work and make a living and feed their family, it's a big deal. And so, if they have a little shoulder pain, okay, well, that's not a big deal as long as they can do their work activities. And then recreational activities have to do with quality of life. So if you can't do your yoga practice or take your Pilates lessons or play tennis or swim or surf, you really have an impact to your quality of life and your sense of fun and happiness and well-being and the things that relieve your stress and make you happy in life. So those are the kind of things that we'll talk about in the individual cases each week. And so you can read about this. There's also a sample NAGI grid on page 107 that you can take a look at that has examples of how to categorize the problems, goals, and treatment, as well as the impairments, the activity limitations, and participation restrictions. Okay? So in your S1, R1 to 3 manual, you'll find on page 14 and 15 the description of the stages of rehabilitation. So what that means is how are you going to categorize your patient as you start to give them Pilates exercises to affect their either diagnosis or their functional limitation or whatever it is that your goal is with them, whether it's leg strengthening, is it stabilization of their spine, is it shoulder mobility, whatever it is that you're looking at. How do you categorize that stage of rehabilitation and know what exercises are going to be safe to apply? So stage 1 is generally what we call pain control or stabilization. Now the word pain control is really confusing because it's not generally just the pain that's going to dictate what exercises you're going to give them. So if you can decide where the lesion is, that's one of the most important things, is to decide where the lesion is and whether or not you're going to move it or you're going to stabilize it. So one of the examples that I love to give is spondylolisthesis. So say somebody has a spondylolisthesis at L4 or 5, and they have a poor control over that segment. So what you'd want to do is stabilize that segment, but you'd also want to mobilize the segments above and below. So say someone has degenerative disc disease, and they have a very stiff spine. They wake up in the morning, they're really stiff, they take a hot shower, they take a walk, they do a little movement, they feel better. That's a very typical pattern for degenerative joint disease or degenerative disc disease. So those people are going to need movement exercises, not stabilization exercises necessarily. So often it comes down to deciding whether or not you're going to do dead bugs or pelvic clock. So for a spine problem. For a frozen shoulder, the last thing you want to do is stabilize the shoulder joint. You want to maybe stabilize the scapula on the back and move the glenohumeral joint. which would be categorized as a stage 2. So meaning that you're going to mobilize the joint. So stage 1 and stage 2 are not necessarily sequential. You might often just say they are categorized as a stabilization patient for that lesion or a mobilization lesion. So that means that you're going to either mobilize the joint or stabilize the joint or the segment or whatever it is you've identified as the lesion. So those two categories can be intermingled a little bit. So if you're going to give somebody dead bugs, or pelvic clocks, or bridging to articulate the spine, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't also give them, say, a dead bug exercise or a femur arc. So you still can add in some stabilization exercises to strengthen the abdominal wall, to strengthen the connection between the ribs and pelvis, and to have better control. But you wouldn't want to do only stabilization exercises with somebody that has DJD. Got to get them moving, and very soon. And that's usually what's going to make them feel better. So with each example, we'll be going through how to characterize what types of exercises are going to be best for that client, and depending on their diagnosis and depending on the lesion site that you identify. So the most important thing is to find out where is that primary lesion site and what are you going to do with it. Are you going to move it? Are you going to stabilize it? Then you identify the stage of rehabilitation. Is that going to be a stage 1, a stage 2? You may have a healthy client that just needs to exercise and they're ready for stage 3. That is rarely the case, but usually you find some area of poor control that they need to work on. And then, so your stage 3 is going to be your dynamic stabilization. You're decreasing the assistance. So you're decreasing the springs from maybe red springs to blue springs to yellow springs. You're decreasing the level of assistance in the Pilates environment and maybe turning them in a different relationship to gravity and having them do more resistive type exercises as they progress. Then you're going to combine movements. So you're adding in rotation combined with flexion, combined with side bending, maybe circumduction. Maybe you're adding in a level of coordination with them. That's going to tell you that they're in a stage 3. And the challenge to the core is also important with stage 3. Such as a leg pull or push-up. That's actually a stage 3 exercise because of the challenge to the torso and the core. It's sort of a whole body movement integration exercise. So another important concept to talk about is the functional re-education from foreign to familiar environment. There's often a challenge from the medical community saying Pilates is not functional. You're doing footwork on the reformer, laying on their back. How is that helping them with their function? So what we're actually doing there is we're working on neuromuscular control and neuromuscular patterning. And we're taking the joints and putting them in an unfamiliar relationship to gravity, having them re-pattern that motor plan for how they do that activity in a non-weight bearing environment so that maybe reduces the pain or reduces the load on the joints. And then you return them to standing and help them understand what they just learned in supine. But often we think that people don't make that transition up into function if you don't help them make that transition. So you need to reiterate that with them. Okay, now when you are doing your footwork on the reformer and your pelvis is in this position, your hip is moving in the socket, I want you to take that same idea and bring it to standing and bring it into function. Maybe you go to the chair and you do some standing leg pumps. Maybe you do some squats, with the springs on the trapeze table, and then you eventually do squats away from the assistance of the trapeze table. So those kinds of ways of explaining the rationale or describing the rationale to a medical professional, I think, are really important if you get that challenge. We don't get it as much now because Pilates has certainly become much more accepted in the medical community and is more mainstream as exercise. But we used to get that challenge a lot when we first started teaching many years ago.